At dawn, the bells of Paris tolled like a funeral march. Crowds gathered beneath a gray October sky, their breath turning to mist as the blade of the guillotine waited, cold, gleaming, patient. Within the stone walls of the conciergerie, a woman once crowned Queen of France sat motionless. Her name had once commanded nations, Marie Antoinette. Now she was simply the widow Capet. The silks were gone, the jewels stripped away, and the mob outside chanted not her name, but her death. They had come to see vengeance, not justice, to watch the downfall of a dynasty, the execution of everything that once stood for divine right. And yet, behind her silence lay something few could see: dignity in ruin. Her final hours were not the fading of a monarch, but the unraveling of an entire world. This is the gruesome execution of Marie Antoinette, and it was far worse than you think. The summer of 1792 bled into Paris like a fever. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and sweat, and from every alley, the echo of drums and slogans rose like a storm building over a city that no longer feared its kings. Within the Tuileries Palace, the last fragile fortress of royal authority, Marie Antoinette paced through the gilded halls that had once hosted masquerades and music. The chandeliers still hung above her head, but their candles had long burned out. In their place came the flicker of torches outside, carried by men whose voices demanded not reverence but revenge. On the morning of August 10th, the palace awoke not to ceremony but to warning bells. The revolution had come to its gates. For Marie Antoinette, it was not merely the fall of a crown, it was the collapse of an entire identity. Only 3 years earlier, she had ruled beside her husband Louis XVI, surrounded by the brilliance of Versailles and the endless rituals of power. Yet the failed escape to Varennes in 1791 had shattered whatever illusion of loyalty remained between the monarchy and the people. What began as suspicion had turned into hatred. Pamphlets depicted her as a serpent in silk, the Austrian traitor who drained France's coffers and mocked its hunger. To the crowds, she was no longer the Queen of France, but Madame Deficit, the symbol of excess and betrayal. Her foreign blood became proof of her guilt, her accent a weapon turned against her. Behind the palace gates, the royal guards, Swiss mercenaries devoted to the king, waited for orders that never came. They had pledged to defend the crown, but Louis hesitated, torn between the instinct to survive and the fear of spilling French blood. That hesitation sealed their fate. As the mob advanced across the gardens, the king led his family through a side passage toward the Legislative Assembly, believing he might find refuge in the same revolution that sought his head. The moment they stepped outside, the monarchy ceased to exist. The Tuileries became a slaughterhouse. By the time the smoke cleared, hundreds lay dead, guards, servants, and citizens alike. The throne of France was nothing more than splintered wood and ashes. Dragged through the streets under armed escort, the royal family was taken to the Temple, a medieval fortress that would serve as their new home and their prison. Inside its cold stone walls, the Queen of France was stripped of her titles and referred to simply as the Widow Capet, a name chosen to erase her lineage. The gold and silk of her former life were replaced by rough linen and iron locks. She could no longer address her husband as the king, or her children as royal heirs. Every gesture of affection, every word of dignity, was rewritten by decree into the language of humiliation. Her world shrank to a handful of narrow rooms and the sound of guards pacing outside her door. Yet even in confinement, she refused to bend to despair. Witnesses from the Commune reported her bearing as proud, her voice calm even as mobs gathered outside chanting her name in hatred. She spent her nights sewing and writing letters she knew would never be delivered. In one note to her sister-in-law, she wrote of the quiet horror of hearing her children cry through the stone walls, unable to reach them. It was in those nights that the legend of Marie Antoinette as the heartless queen began to die, replaced by something far more human, a mother trapped between history and annihilation. By the end of that first winter in the Temple, France had abolished its monarchy. The Republic was born from blood, and its founders promised that no trace of royalty would survive. The Queen, once the embodiment of divine privilege, was now a prisoner awaiting judgment in a nation that demanded not only her life, but her humiliation. And though she did not yet know it, every step from that moment forward would lead her closer to the guillotine, one heartbeat at a time. when the black carriage arrived at the gates of the conciergerie before dawn on August 2, 1793. It did not bring a queen. It brought what the revolution had reduced her to, a prisoner awaiting erasure. The guards of the Paris Commune recorded her name in the prison ledger as Widow Capet, a deliberate act of obliteration. Marie Antoinette entered the fortress through the same archway where hundreds had passed on their way to the guillotine. The river Seine lapped quietly against the stone embankment, carrying away the echoes of the condemned. Above her, the spires of Notre Dame cut the mist like silent witnesses. It was said that when she crossed the threshold, she did not look back. She understood that she was walking into history's darkest antechamber, the place where royalty met oblivion. The cell assigned to her measured barely 3 meters long by 2 wide. It sat low to the ground, its single slit window half covered by bars so thick they devoured the light. The air was heavy with the stench of damp stone, mildew, and human decay. The conciergerie was known as the antechamber of death, where prisoners waited days or weeks before their execution. Marie Antoinette was placed under permanent surveillance by 2 gendarmes who stood watch at all hours, never turning away, even when she changed her clothes or knelt to pray. Their presence stripped away the last fragments of her privacy. The same woman who had once been surrounded by courtiers now slept beneath the eyes of armed strangers. When she was first brought in, she had no bed, only straw and a wooden stool. The revolution had decided that comfort was treason. Witnesses who later testified before the tribunal described her condition as one of slow, deliberate destruction. A prison doctor noted her pallor and the trembling of her hands. Her health had already been declining since her imprisonment in the temple. But here, in the damp shadows of the conciergerie, her body began to fail entirely. She suffered from hemorrhaging, exhaustion, and fainting fits brought on by starvation. The revolution allowed her barely enough food to survive: thin broth, hard bread, and water drawn from the river. The torment was not physical alone. It was psychological, designed to extinguish dignity. The guards mocked her accent, calling her Austrian dog. Each insult was another knife driven into the memory of who she once was. And yet she did not plead, she did not curse. According to the officer Jean-Baptiste Miconis, who was stationed in her cell, she carried herself with a stillness that unnerved even her captors. She spoke rarely, but when she did, her words were measured, her tone unbroken. Her silence was not weakness, it was defiance. At night, she wrote small notes to her surviving daughter and to her sister-in-law, Madame Elizabeth, letters filled with restrained grief and impossible tenderness. One of these notes, intercepted by the Committee of Public Safety, contained a single line that revealed more of her truth than any speech could. "I have nothing left to hope for in this world." Those words, never delivered, remain one of the last fragments of her voice. Weeks blurred into months. The sound of the guillotine echoed faintly from across the Seine, marking each passing day with another death. She could hear the distant cheers of the crowd whenever the blade fell, a grim reminder of what awaited her. On some nights, she prayed aloud, her voice thin and trembling, rising through the cracks of the ceiling like smoke. On others, she simply sat motionless, staring at the reflection of the moonlight on the damp floor. In that reflection, she must have seen the ghosts of her children, her husband, her vanished world, all of it fading beyond reach. By the end of September, her appearance had transformed so completely that even those who had known her at court could not recognize her. Her hair, once golden, had turned entirely white. Her skin had lost its color, her hands, once adorned with diamonds, were now cracked and cold. But in her eyes, witnesses said, there still flickered something unbroken, a small light that neither time nor humiliation could extinguish. In the stillness of her final nights, Marie Antoinette ceased to be the hated Queen of France and became something else entirely, a symbol of endurance beneath ruin. The revolution could strip her of her crown, her children, her name, but it could not destroy the quiet dignity with which she awaited the end. On the morning of October 14, 1793, the doors of the Revolutionary Tribunal opened to the sound of marching boots and murmuring voices. Inside the great hall of the conciergerie, lit by smoky torches and crowded with restless citizens, history prepared to devour one of its own children. The woman who had once presided over the court of Versailles now stood before another kind of court entirely, one built not on ceremony but on vengeance. Marie Antoinette entered the chamber dressed in plain black, her head uncovered, her once ornate hair cropped short and white as frost. She stood alone at the wooden platform, framed by the iron bars that separated her from the mob that had come to watch her fall. To many, she was not a defendant but a trophy, a relic of tyranny presented for sacrifice. The air was thick with whispers, and from every corner of the hall, faces leaned forward to witness the slow unmaking of a queen. Antoine Quentin Fouquier Tinville, the prosecutor known for his merciless efficiency, presided over the trial with the cold authority of a man who believed himself the servant of history. His task was not to seek truth, but to deliver spectacle. The list of accusations was long and venomous: conspiracy against the Republic, communication with foreign enemies, orchestration of counter-revolutionary plots, and, most vile of all, incest with her own son. The final charge, extracted from the terrified child imprisoned and manipulated by revolutionary agents, turned the courtroom into a theater of horror. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the assembly, not from outrage at the alleged act, but from the audacity of the claim itself. Even among the revolutionaries, there were those who flinched at such cruelty, but none dared to speak. The Republic demanded her guilt, and silence had become the price of survival. When the accusations were read aloud, Marie Antoinette lifted her eyes and looked toward her accusers with a composure that startled even her enemies. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was quiet yet steady, stripped of the grandeur that had once filled the halls of Versailles. She denied every charge of treason and manipulation, answering each question with the restraint of a woman who had already lost everything but her dignity. And when the subject of her son was raised, that vile accusation meant to destroy her in spirit as well as body. She did not defend herself with rage or despair. Instead, she turned to the crowd and said, "I appeal to all mothers." For a moment, the hall fell silent. Even those who had come to hate her felt the weight of those words, the undeniable humanity of a mother condemned for the sins others had invented. That silence, fragile and brief, was perhaps the last time Paris remembered her as a woman rather than a monster. The trial continued for 2 days under the glow of oil lamps that cast long shadows across the walls. The evidence brought against her was little more than rumor, forged correspondence, and fragments of letters seized from the royal archives. Among them was the so-called armoire de fer, a hidden safe found in the ruins of the Tuileries Palace. Inside were documents claimed to prove her secret dealings with Austria and the émigré nobles, though few bore her actual signature. It did not matter. The verdict had already been written before the trial began. Witness after witness stepped forward to repeat what pamphlets had already taught the people to believe, that the Queen of France had been the architect of their misery. The defense was given no time to challenge the lies, no right to summon testimony in her favor. The tribunal was not there to listen, it was there to condemn. By the second night, when the jury finally retired to deliberate, the atmosphere in the hall had grown feverish. The crowd outside waited impatiently, chanting, demanding the verdict that everyone already knew. At 4 a.m. on October 16th, the gavel struck wood, and the silence that followed carried the weight of centuries. The judgment was read in a single sentence: death by guillotine. Marie Antoinette listened without protest. No tears escaped her eyes, no plea crossed her lips. Her face was pale, her hands clasped before her as if in prayer. The guards led her back to her cell, and as the heavy door closed behind her, the echoes of the verdict seemed to linger in the corridors like a funeral toll. The revolution had found its justice, and the widow Capet had been sentenced not merely to die, but to become the symbol of a world forever undone. The morning of October 16, 1793, broke cold and gray over the Seine. A damp mist clung to the stones of the conciergerie, and the sound of horses echoed faintly through the courtyard. Inside her cell, Marie Antoinette awoke not to the sound of bells or footsteps, but to the realization that the waiting was over. At precisely 7 o'clock, the guards entered with the formal notice of execution. She rose slowly, her movements deliberate, her face devoid of expression. There were no courtiers to dress her, no attendants to comfort her. Only the indifferent eyes of soldiers and the prison clerk recording each gesture, as if history itself required an inventory of her final hours. She was given a plain white chemise and a bonnet to cover her cropped hair, which had turned entirely white during her months of confinement. Her hands were bound behind her back with coarse rope, and for the first time since her imprisonment, she was permitted a mirror. not for vanity, but to ensure she faced her death clean and composed. When she looked into it, she saw not the Queen of France, but a pale reflection of endurance, the last remnant of a dying world. Unlike her husband Louis XVI, who had been executed in a closed carriage shielded from the crowd, Marie Antoinette was denied even that small mercy. The Revolutionary Tribunal ordered that she be transported to the scaffold in an open wooden cart, the same used for thieves, murderers, and beggars. The humiliation was deliberate. They wished to display her as a conquered enemy, not a fallen monarch. As the heavy gates creaked open, the crowd surged forward, pressing against the barricades for a glimpse of the woman who had once ruled over their misery. Some shouted curses, others jeered and threw mud, but many simply stared in silence, as if unable to reconcile the fragile figure before them with the phantom of decadence they had imagined. Witnesses later wrote that she sat upright in the cart, her posture rigid, her gaze fixed straight ahead. She neither wept nor turned her eyes from the mob. The white of her gown stood out like a ghost against the gray city, a vision of purity carried toward its end. The procession wound slowly through the streets of Paris, from the Conciergerie to the Place de la Révolution. The route was long by design, meant to stretch each minute into a spectacle of punishment. The air was filled with the clatter of hooves and the rhythm of drums as soldiers flanked the cart, sabers drawn. At the Rue Saint-Honoré, the crowd thickened into a living wall, and windows overflowed with onlookers craning to witness the moment when the revolution would at last erase the last trace of monarchy. Some accounts describe a strange quiet falling over the city as the cart advanced, not reverence, but a kind of collective breath held in anticipation. Among those who saw her was the radical priest Jacques Roux, who later wrote that the widow Capet appeared calm, her head held high, her lips unmoving, as though already beyond this world. The ride lasted over an hour, each turn of the wheels grinding the past deeper into dust. When the cart reached the scaffold at midday, the square was a sea of humanity. The guillotine rose in the center like an altar of the new faith, the cult of equality born from blood. Executioner Henri Sanson and his assistants stood waiting, their faces expressionless beneath the red caps of liberty. As she was led up the wooden steps, Marie Antoinette stumbled slightly and placed her foot on Sanson's boot. Without hesitation, she looked at him and said softly, "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose." Those would be her final words, a gesture of grace in the face of annihilation. The crowd, sensing the gravity of the moment, fell eerily silent. Even the wind seemed to still as she was positioned beneath the blade. The executioner pulled the lever, and at precisely 12:15 p.m., the blade fell with a single echoing thud. A roar of "Vive la République" erupted from the square, but it was said that for a brief instant afterward, an unnatural quiet lingered, as if even the city itself hesitated to breathe. Her head was lifted for the crowd, and then the body, once adorned with the jewels of Europe, was placed into a plain wooden coffin and carted away to an unmarked grave at the Cimetière de la Madeleine. Her death was not merely the end of a queen, it was the burial of an entire order. The divine right of kings, the illusion of permanence, the belief that beauty and power could shield one from the tide of time. As the sun dipped behind the clouds and the crowd began to disperse, Paris did not celebrate so much as it trembled. The revolution had claimed its ultimate symbol, and in doing so, it revealed the terrible price of its own creation. When the echo of the guillotine's blade finally faded across the Place de la Révolution, Paris exhaled a strange, uneasy silence. The crowd dispersed as though waking from a fever dream, leaving behind the smell of iron and the imprint of countless feet pressed into wet earth. For the revolutionaries, the deed was done. The most hated woman in France was gone, and the Republic had proven that no bloodline, no crown, no divine right could stand above the will of the people. Yet beneath the roar of triumph lingered an emptiness, the sense that something far greater than a life had been severed. The revolution had not merely executed a queen, it had slain its own reflection, the ghost of what it once sought to become. Even as the streets filled with cries of "Vive la République," an unease settled over the city, for the justice that demanded blood could no longer be controlled. In the days that followed, the newspapers printed embellished stories of her final moments, some to glorify, others to vilify. Pamphleteers described her calmness at the scaffold as arrogance, while foreign observers saw it as courage. Across Europe, monarchs shuddered at the spectacle, for if France could decapitate its queen, no throne was safe. In Vienna, her brother Emperor Francis II mourned her not only as kin but as a warning. Even the empires of centuries could be unmade by a crowd's roar. The British press, once her fiercest critic, suddenly turned sympathetic, portraying her as a tragic figure destroyed by the madness she could not comprehend. And within Paris itself, whispers began to spread among those who had witnessed her final grace, that perhaps she had died not as the monster they had imagined, but as a woman who met death with the dignity her judges had lost. Years later, when the blood of the terror had dried and the guillotine's shadow had receded from the squares, the people of France began to see her differently. The unmarked grave in the Cimetière de la Madeleine, where her body lay among hundreds of anonymous victims, became a place of quiet pilgrimage. In 1815, when the Bourbons returned to power, her remains and those of Louis XVI were exhumed and reinterred at the Basilica of Saint-Denis, the resting place of kings. The ceremony was somber, attended by those who had once cheered her death but now sought forgiveness through remembrance. Marble monuments rose above the crypt, bearing her name once again: Marie Antoinette d'Autriche, Reine de France. History, ever merciless, had begun its slow transformation of villain into martyr. The centuries that followed would rewrite her story again and again. To some, she remained the frivolous queen who danced while her people starved. To others, she became the embodiment of doomed innocence crushed by the machinery of revolution. Her letters, preserved in the archives of France, revealed a voice neither monstrous nor divine but deeply human, anxious, tender, at times defiant, and always aware of her impending fate. Artists painted her as both saint and sinner. Writers romanticized her fall as a tragedy of beauty destroyed by envy. Even modern historians, armed with reason and distance, cannot escape the haunting paradox she left behind, that the same woman who symbolized excess could also embody endurance. Her death, once an act of vengeance, had become a mirror reflecting the cruelty and the brilliance of an age that devoured itself in pursuit of freedom. In the end, the story of Marie Antoinette is not simply about a queen who lost her head. It is about a civilization tearing away its illusions. Her execution marked the end of an era when birth defined destiny and privilege masked inequality. But it also revealed how revolutions, born from justice, can descend into hunger for retribution. Her final gesture, the quiet apology to her executioner, endures as one of history's most fragile proofs that humanity can survive even within horror. Perhaps that is why her memory refuses to die, because in the cold machinery of history, her death remains uncomfortably alive. And so, as the candles of the past flicker in our imagination, we are left to ask ourselves whether her end was justice or tragedy, whether the revolution freed a people or simply replaced one tyranny with another. Whatever answer time chooses, the image of the white-haired woman in the open cart will forever haunt the conscience of the modern world. If you found this story compelling, if it made you feel the chill of history breathing through the centuries, remember to like, subscribe, and share. Each voice that keeps these stories alive ensures that the lessons of the past are never silenced again.